I am so glad you convinced me that the family car should be the Defender 110. It is so beautiful inside. It's so comfortable and it just feels indestructible.
Yes, it really is. I've been waiting a long time for the new model to come out. The Defender 110, I'm telling you, it's my favorite car of all times. It's my third one. You know, I have stories of going off road. The guy managed the group. He was like, "What are you doing in this beautiful car?" I'm like, "I'm going off road." He's like, "Are you sure? Because you can use one of ours." And then they look like Mad Max cars. I'm like, no, we're going to do this. And he was shocked.
Wow. Well, it's great because the Defender has been reimagined for 21st century adventure, and its unparalleled off-road ability as well as its robust interior are invaluable whether you're headed towards uncharted territory or just a weekend of exploration. The Defender 110 tackles challenging surroundings with absolute confidence. The SUV conveys strength outside and in, featuring peerless technology like an intuitive driver display and an award-winning infotainment system. That's my favorite part, to keep you connected no matter where the journey takes you. Adventure is unique to everyone, and so is the Defender. Choose from the two-door Defender 90, the four-door Defender 110, or the larger Defender 130 with the ability to seat up to 8 passengers. You'll find uncompromising performance in all three. So pack up and go even further with the Defender 110. Learn more at LandRoverUSA.com/Defender.
This isn't your average business podcast, and he's not your average host. This is the James Altucher Show on the Stansberry Radio Network.
So I'm here with Dan Buettner, and you might not have heard his name, but I'm going to tell you right now, this guy just ruined my life. And Dan, welcome to the show. I'm going to describe who you are in a second, but welcome to the show.
Well, I'm good to be here, and I'm interested to hear how I've already ruined your life.
Yeah, so Dan, you have a book coming out, depending on when this podcast comes out. I think your book's coming out today, and it's I know it's called The Blue Zones. What's the full title?
Well, it's the Blue Zone Solution: Eating and Living Like the World's Healthiest People.
And describe what a blue zone is, because I think this is fascinating.
It's part of a 10-year project by National Geographic that sought to identify pockets around the world, demographically confirmed, geographically defined, where people live the longest. And
not just live the longest, but I get from all your talks and everything, it's people who live to be past the age of 100.
Well, there's actually 3 measurements. One is percentage of centenarians. The second one is life expectancy. And the third is something called lowest rate of middle-age mortality. In other words, they hit about an age 90 at the highest rate without chronic disease.
Okay, so it's not like when you mention to people, like when I mention to people, oh, would you like to live to be 100? A lot of people say no because I don't want to have dementia or I don't want to be sick. But you're specifically identifying areas where people live to a very high age without having necessarily disability.
That's right. They stay sharp to the very end. They tend to die quickly in their sleep and occasionally after sex.
So I'm going to ask you about that in a second. But one of my favorite stories from one of your talks was you talk about a 97-year-old guy. I think he was living in either California. I think he was living in California, in the blue zone in California that you mentioned. And a contractor, he wanted to build a fence, and a contractor was going to charge him $6,000. And he said, heck, I could do it myself. So he spent 4 days, getting the cement, digging the holes, building the fence. And then you mentioned on the 4th day, he ended up in the ER. And then you mentioned he was the doctor performing open heart surgery.
Yeah, he wasn't the patient. He was the one doing open heart surgery. His name is Ellsworth Wareham, and he lives in Loma Linda, California. And he really exemplifies the lifestyle of one of our blue zones, among the Adventists. He's done everything right his whole life. And when we shot those pictures, he's about 95. I was there a week ago Sunday in Loma Linda, where he is now 100 years old. He's still out back doing yard work. He drove me around with NBC. we did a piece, it'll be on this week for the Today Show, of Ellsworth driving me through Loma Linda, pontificating about the secrets of reaching age 100. And he's actually someone who can speak with credibility.
So two questions on that. One is, would you let yourself be operated on by someone who's 100 years old? And to qualify, you mentioned kind of sort of cultural attitudes towards people who are older, and often in the U.S. we tend to, your social equity, as you put it, tends to go down as we age. But in these communities of blue zones, social equity tends to go up. Like, we appreciate their wisdom and their knowledge. So clearly people don't mind their being operated on by 100. But I wonder about your personal opinion on that.
Yeah, so the reality is there are two surgeons in the room, and he's the number 2 surgeon. And most of heart surgery is pretty routine. And 96% of the time it goes exactly as planned. 4% of the time something goes awry. And when you have a guy like Ellsworth who's been operating for 60 years and he's been through 12,000 operations, if you're among that 4% where something odd happens, here you got a guy in the room who's seen it and knows how to handle it. And that's actually how the first surgeon described the huge benefit of having someone like Ellsworth around. They are repositories of wisdom and human experience. And that is an asset that is frequently diminished in our society and really celebrated in blue zones around the world.
So that's a really great point, because it shows that you were not only researching him, but you talked to the first doctor who he worked with. I imagine maybe you talked to some of the patients. I don't know. But the other thing that this brings up is, now that he's turned 100, I love the fact that now he's an expert on how to live to 100 and is happy to pontificate about it.
That's kind of the whole ethos of blue zones. That if you want to live to 100, what you should learn the lessons from people who've actually reached that age. And we like to think that our team has done a deeper dive and gained a better understanding of what the whole ecosystem around people who make it to 100 is, and be able to convey that to Americans.
So the reason I mentioned only half humorously that you ruined my life is that you mentioned all of these things in one of your talks on how to live to be over 100, and I basically do like the opposite of all of them. So I try. I think I was worse 10 years ago. I've gotten a lot better in the past, let's say 5 years, but you give 9 basic principles, and they're not that easy to do. Like, if you're used to eating meat all your life, it's hard to switch to like a plant-based diet. I don't know if you want to describe some of the most important principles. Well, first off, where are the blue zones? Where are the blue zones that you think are the most interesting to study?
I not only think it, I know it.
Okay.
The areas where people are living the longest are as follows. The longest women on the planet live in Okinawa. The longest lived men on the planet live in the highlands of Sardinia in the Nuoro province. The third blue zone is off the coast of Turkey on the Greek island of Ikaria. There they live about 8 years longer than Americans do, but they have almost no dementia. The Nicoya Peninsula of Costa Rica, people there have about a 2.5-fold better chance of reaching a healthy age 90 than we do in first world America. And then in the United States, the longevity all-stars live around Loma Linda, California, because that's the highest concentration of Seventh-day Adventists in the world.
So this all brings to a couple of questions, and they're kind of all over the place, but all of the places you mentioned seem to be nice climates. Like, I'm never going to deal with negative 10 degree temperatures, and I'm probably not going to deal with 120 degree temperatures.
Well, there is something to that. And we think it's because that regular sunshine affords and vitamin D, but also that it's easier to be outside. It's easier to have gardens all around. But, 30 years ago, the highest life expectancy in the world was in Denmark. So I don't think you have to live in a warm, sunny place to live a long time. It may just make it a little easier.
Right. Maybe that's the point, that it's easier to like take a walk around the block if you're living in a climate where you don't have to wear 65 layers of winter coats or whatever.
Well, you're calling me from New York, right?
Right now, I'm in Florida specifically because I do live in New York, but I spend a lot of time in Florida just because in the winter it's hard to move around.
Well, I will tell you that New York is actually a bit of a blue zone. Now,
Really?
New York, there's about a third the rate of obesity than there is in Middle America. And you started saying to yourself, well, what is it about New York? Is it better gyms? Well, probably not. Better diets? But people walk there. Just about every trip to work or to go out to eat or go to a friend's house, occasions a walk. And it's that kind of mindless or natural physical activity that adds up. And none of these blue zones do you see these centenarians going out and exercising, or they never pump iron or run marathons or do triathlons or, live a rich rural life. They're people whose day is just landmined with nudges to keep them moving. And I think that's the bigger idea than having to worry about changing your habits.
It's really fascinating because in 2002, I moved from New York City to about a town about 70 miles north, and there wasn't as much. I would walk every day in New York City. I would walk everywhere, but there wasn't really walking opportunities. It was a little more rural, and where I moved. And I literally gained, and I had been the same weight for forever since I was a kid. And I literally gained 30 pounds in a 2-month period once I moved. And it took a while to reduce the weight. I had to basically go back to New York City and start walking around a lot more. So you have a really good point there.
I'll tell you something shocking, James. The average American burns fewer than 100 calories a day engaged in quote unquote exercise. So as a public health initiative, it is a catastrophic failure. And we've been spending 60 years trying to tell people to go out and exercise, but it hasn't worked. We increasingly get more obese as a nation because it's hard to remember and it requires discipline and it's unpleasant. A much better strategy takes a page right from these blue zones around the world and thinks about creating environments where people are nudged into moving mindlessly, like New York, like Boulder, Colorado, San Luis Obispo, Provo, Utah, Minneapolis.
I love how you, in one of your talks, and I do have a second question about the areas you mentioned, but I want to just skip 1 second to, well, I think it was Okinawa. You mentioned they actually serve their food on smaller plates, and so that helps them prevent the obesity problem.
See, it's another. Now, once again, that's an environmental nudge. It's not something you have to remember every day. We first observed it in Okinawa, and since then, one of our partners, Brian Wansing from Cornell Food Lab, found that indeed, if you're eating off a 10-inch plate, you're probably consuming 20% or so fewer calories than you would if you're eating off a 13 or 14-inch plates that many houses are stocked with.
Oh, go ahead.
No, it's just that that's something you can go out right now and say, I'm getting rid of all my huge plates and I'm going to buy smaller plates. And you've just set yourself up for lowering your caloric intake for as many years or decades as you have those plates. That's the kind of the blue zone's way, as opposed to remember to eat less, which you won't do.
Right, because as you mentioned, it takes 30 minutes for the stomach to communicate to the brain that it's full. So by the time your brain thinks it's full, you've already eaten another 20 or 30% in calories.
Right, and that's why we encourage people to do whatever you can do to eat more slowly. You tend to eat more slowly if you're eating with your family, as opposed to eating with one hand on the steering wheel, or taking electronics out of your kitchen, or what we observed in all blue zones. And I'm not a particularly religious person, but they do express some gratitude before the meal. They put some punctuation between the monkey brain, hurry, rush, got to do all this in my day, and they're meal. And when you do that, people tend to slow down, and there's more time for that belly to brain connection to be made.
Well, so the other thing I want to mention about the specific blue zones, you mentioned Greece, which they of course eat what's called a Mediterranean diet, and that seems to be linked in studies to a decrease in dementia and Alzheimer's. Do you think that's true?
Yes, I know a plant-based diet as a whole correlates very strongly with lower rates of dementia. But our blue zone there, Icaria, has its own special variant of the Mediterranean diet. Firstly, they adhere to it more so than any other place in the world. But secondly, there's a few components. Number one, they eat more potatoes, not French fries, but sort of boiled potatoes. Number two, more greens, about 70 or 80 different types of greens. And a lot of them look like something you'd whack on the side of the freeway. But they're full of powerful antioxidants and anti-inflammatories, and they're
like what?
Fennel, for example, a dandelion, type of dandelion, actually, a type of arugula. They generally fall under the rubric of horta, and they're also baked in pies. So instead of putting cherries or lemon meringue, they make these delicious pies. So you get a little bit of the naughty, the sort of bread, but a lot of the good, and they taste delicious. And at the end of the day, I can tell you all day long that greens are good for you and make you live a long time. But if you don't like them, you're not going to eat them. So if I could show you a way to eat them where it actually tastes good, now there you have something that can work and can work for a long time.
So it's not so much that they're down on sugar if they're baking them into the pies, or what's the story there?
There's no sugar at all. It's a savory pie. Mm. So they'll boil them, and then they'll lightly saute them with some olive oil and perhaps some garlic and some other spices, and then that becomes the filling. And then the pie only has the crust on the bottom, so it's kind of an open-faced pie. Mm. But the combination is really delightful. There's something I think that ameliorates the bitterness when you have them baked in a pie, like a savory pie.
So when I was preparing for this, I called somebody I know from Okinawa, and he said one of the things they do is because I was asking about carbs and whether carbs are involved at all. And he said they do eat carbs, but it's in a form they call, resistant starch. So like, for instance, pasta, they'll make the pasta, but then they'll cool it so that it becomes more like fiber and just go through the system instead of converting to sugar in the system. Have you noticed anything like that?
Well, Okinawa, it's the soba noodles usually, which is buckwheat, which has a lower glycemic index than the white noodles that we normally cook with. The starch actually, for about 70% of the dietary intake of Okinawans to 1950 were attributed to one starchy food, and that was sweet potatoes. Mm. And again, if you want to know what a centenarian ate to live to be 100, you can't just ask them what they're eating today. You need to know what they were eating in the 20s and the 40s and the 60s and the 80s. And so our research went out and grabbed the dietary surveys done over the past 100 years in all 5 blue zones, and we did a meta-analysis. And I think our average really offers some pretty powerful lessons for Americans.
And so what's the story of starch and carbs?
About 65% of the blue zone diet is carbs.
Really?
Yes, but remember, James, lollipops and lentil beans, they're both carbs, right? So it's the type of carbs. And you've heard this before, they're complex carbs. So they're real 100% whole grains. They are beans. The cornerstone of every longevity diet in the world is some sort of bean. They eat about a cup of beans a day. And they actually eat bread. And one interesting find you'll see in Blue Zone solution is sourdough bread. So I think we kind of uniformly write off bread as a net negative. It's going to make me fat. It's empty carbs. But sourdough bread, which is leavened with lactobacillus, actual bacteria, as opposed to the fungus yeast that commercial breads are made with, actually lowers glycemic index. In other words, a piece of real sourdough bread, like we see in Italy and Sardinia, will actually reduce the insulin reaction to the meal. So put it simply, your meal burns more slowly and it's much easier on your system, your pancreas and so forth, and much less likely that meal will be used for energy instead of converted to fat on your midsection. So these subtleties are hugely important, especially over time.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's like it requires work to make a shift. So like United States culture is not really, as they always say in the supermarket, don't shop in the middle aisles, only shop on the side aisles. And we're not really, the whole way we shop for food is different from what these Blue Zone diets are like.
Yeah, and it's hard. Every time you go out to eat, on average, you're burning about 200 more calories than you would be if you ate at home. And if you're in the highest quartile of meat consumption of Americans, you're about 400% more likely to get cancer than if you're eating a plant-based diet, the lowest quartile. And you say to yourself, well, how do I remember this? How am I supposed to cook? Well, I'll tell you the secret. The secret is to think about who your three best friends are. If your three best friends are sitting home and eating Doritos on the couch, or every meal is some slab of dead cow they cook on the grill, guess what you're going to eat when you go see them? So cultivating friends who, have dinner parties and they eat plant-based, because when you hang out with them, you're naturally going to eat better, and you don't have to remember it. And it's pleasant because presumably they're your friends, and a meal is just part of a bigger picture of a pleasant evening. So,
yeah, that's it's sort of like that expression. You're the average of the 5 people you spend most of your time with.
I haven't seen that, but that's brilliant.
So I have a question. You mentioned in one of your talks that evolution doesn't necessarily reward people who live to 100. Evolution rewards procreative success. So they want, evolution itself, or your DNA wants you to live long enough to reproduce and wants you to live long enough to be a grandfather or grandmother. And I was just curious, why grandfather or grandmother? I kind of get the reproduction part, but why the grandfather part?
Yeah, this is true in every mammal, that every mammal lives about 2.5 times the age of procreation when you can first start procreating. And that's the way evolution works. You need to live long enough to have a baby. I mean, to keep your species going, right? To have a baby. And as a parent, you have to be around to make sure that parent gets to adulthood, to the age of procreation. And once they procreate, therefore you become a grandparent, you're actually not that important in the evolutionary scheme of things, because now your kid is the parent of that next generation, and you become marginalized. Now, I will add that in our blue zones, we see a grandmother effect, and these cultures tend to keep aging grandparents near the family. And these aging grandparents, they've been through the economic downturns, the famines, the epidemics. They've learned resiliency. They have sometimes a century of wisdom that they can contribute to the family, both their children and their children's children, to better their survival. So this grandmother effect is also something we see in all mammalian species, that keeping grandparents nearby even favors the survival of those next two generations, and in turn also favors the survival of the grandparents. So there's kind of this virtuous circle. But yeah.
So after like the age of 60, 65, it's kind of like we're off on our own. Like our DNA could care less about us at that point. Like
I like to describe DNA like cassette tapes. Remember cassette tapes back in the old days?
Yeah, of course.
Cassette tapes. So, we would make a copy of the Eagles' greatest hits or the Beatles or whatever people were listening to back then, and put on a cassette tape. And then we would make a copy of that cassette tape for our friends, and our friends might make a copy of theirs to somebody else. And with each copy, there's a buildup of damage. There's a breakdown in fidelity. And by the time the sixth or seventh cassette is copied down the line, that tape sounds so horrible you can barely listen to it. Kind of the same thing happens to our cells. Our cells turn over about almost every cell in your body, about 100 trillion cells, turn themselves over about once every 7 years. And when they do that, there's some damage. And that damage doubles every time those cells replicate every 7 years. So a 65-year-old, they're not only older, but the rate at which they're getting older is about 150 times faster than a 12-year-old.
So,
and
okay,
that number just keeps.
I want to understand that number. So a 65-year-old person ages 150 times faster than, let's say, a 12-year-old. What does that mean? Does that mean the amount of damage that's happening to their cells is 150 times greater than when my cells turned over at the age of 12?
Yes. So the technical definition of aging is a buildup of cellular and molecular damage over time. Technical definition. So you don't start aging until you're 12. So you have technically no damage, theoretically no damage. Then 7 years go by and you're now 19. Now you have a doubling of the damage because your cells don't reproduce like digitally. They reproduce like analog. The reproduction's imperfect. So add 7 more years when you're 26, and now there's 4 times as much damage. When you're 33, there's 8 times. When you're 40, there's 16 times. And the doubling keeps going until at a certain point, the cell no longer is able to duplicate. That's called census. And that basically means the cells don't rejuvenate themselves. They're full of built up damage, which manifests itself in wrinkled skin and hardened arteries and lower brain function and more susceptibility to cancer. And we are in a certain way at this understanding the human body right now, on average, we're kind of programmed to be dead at about 90 or 92. There's some outliers that make it to 100, but they're really genetic freaks, quite honestly.
Why is the average lifespan then in the 70s? Is that because we just have, in addition to the normal damage, we increase it by unhealthy eating habits, unhealthy living habits, and so on?
Yeah, so our eating habits and inactivity and exposure to pollutants, that they foreshorten our lives. And like I said, the average maximum life expectancy of a population living in the first world is about 90 right now. So if you got rid of heart disease, which is almost all avoidable, most cancers avoidable, diabetes type 2 avoidable completely, and most dementia also avoidable, we'd only hit 90. But right now in America, we're only hitting 78. So our crappy lifestyle, our eating fast food and snacks, and salty snacks and candy bars and sodas, and in fact, we've engineered most activity out of our lives, physical activity out of our lives, is costing us about a dozen years of life. And those years could potentially be good years, but we're losing them because of I argue it's mostly our environment. I don't think anybody is fat in this country at their own fault. I think it's because of where we live.
And that's a combination of just in general, our plate size, our lack of activity, the way shopping malls are set up, and so on. The friends we hang out with.
Yeah, so we burn about 1/5 the calories in physical activities as our grandparents did. You can't walk through an airport or go fill up your car with gas or go to get cough medicine without having to walk past a gauntlet of salty snacks and candy bars and soda pops. Or you can't go to – most people in America can't make any trips without having to get in their car. Every day about 350 marketing images for packaged food rinses over our psyche, encouraging us to buy food that's not all that good for us. We're just – our genes are screaming for us to eat fat, sugar, and salt, and our environment is making that way too easy. Whereas historically, we lived in environments of scarcity and hardship, and that kept our genes from letting us make wrong decisions throughout the day. And now we live in a place where the answer is always yes.
Well, what's the effect? What's the percentage effect, would you say, on just general pollutants in the air? And I'm not saying we live in a polluted society, but there's certainly more pollutants in the air than there were, let's say, 200 years ago.
Yeah, it's the fifth biggest killer in America. So, but it's behind heart disease and obesity, metabolic syndrome. So, just guessing it probably shaves 2 to 3 years off life expectancy. If you live in LA, for example, it's probably more like 5 years because you have exposed to more.
I like you mentioned in one of the talks an Okinawa expression that refers to what is the purpose of the day.
Yeah, the term is ikigai, Ikigai, and it roughly means the reason for which you wake up in the morning, and that kind of means purpose. And we know that people who have a strong sense of purpose live 6 or 7 years longer than people who don't. And that if you can articulate your life meaning, it probably cuts in half your mortality, your chances of dying in any given year.
And you said they don't even have a word for retirement. It's just every morning. What is the purpose? What is the purpose I'm waking up? Basically.
Yeah, they don't necessarily say it every day. So there's no word for retirement, but instead ikigai is how views their adult life. So, I actually think retirement's a bad idea. Retirement in this country was more or less invented by the Social Security Administration based on actuary tables. So the Social Security system doesn't go bankrupt. But what it's done is it sent a message to a whole generation of people at a certain age, you're no longer useful. Now go down to Florida or Arizona and go golf. Whereas in blue zones, where age is celebrated and older people feel a sense of responsibility and they're imbued with this purpose, they're not busting their ass every single day in their 80s, 90s, and 100s, but they stay engaged. They do that work that feeds their soul, and they feel useful because of it. And it keeps their brains sharp and their bodies moving and keeps them taking their medicines, and it keeps them connecting with younger generations and new ideas. And here we do the opposite. We warehouse our old.
Well, this brings up an interesting question because the word purpose has many meanings, and some people, they might not ask the question why am I waking up today, but they might ask the question, how soon will I be partner in my law firm? And the answer might be 15 years away. So when does purpose become a negative? Like, I view that as a negative when you're aiming for a goal that's like 5, 10, 15 years away, or you need like X amount of dollars to be happy, or some kind of esoteric goal like that, as opposed to having a goal for or a purpose for right now, today. Do you find any difference there?
Right. So that's a good question. So purpose, the real definition of purpose is the intersection of your values, what you like to do, i.e. if you woke up on a Monday morning and you had $110 million in your bank account, what would you do? What you're good at, and what you can contribute. So those four areas, I would define that as true purpose, not making $100 million. So then when you do that internal inventory, and the answer to those four questions is different for everybody. But once you know that, then making sure that your job is addressing those four facets of purpose, and your volunteer life, and even your hobby life. And if all three of those places are allowing you to live out your purpose, you're going to feel good about your life, and probably for the next 9 decades.
Well, okay, so because I don't want people to rewind, tell me the four questions again.
The intersection of your values, what you like to do, what you're good at, and where you can share them.
Okay, that's great. And again, those could be obviously those are goals, or they're more like themes as opposed to what is the purpose of the day, what is the theme that I'm excited about, and because they all sort of mesh together, as opposed to having a specific goal of having 110 million within 20 years.
I would call it the four pillars of purpose.
Yeah, interesting. So in a lot of the blue zones that you looked at, a lot of these people seem to know each other their entire lives. Like you showed one picture of a group of women who had known each other as a group for 97 years. And the average age in the group was 102 years old. And they were just hanging out, laughing with each other.
That's another Okinawan construct. A word they use, moai, M-O-A-I, moai. And it's really a committed social network. And they happen to last decades or lifetime in Okinawa. But it's an important point we see in all 5 blue zones, where it's this curated, social circle. Kind of, for lack of a better word, I would say it's your personal board of directors. So these aren't just, drinking buddies or buddies you go to the game with, or girls you sit around and talk about, gossip about, celebrities or something. These are people you can call up on a bad day and they'll care. You can have a meaningful conversation with. And this is something that we see kind of naturally occurs in blue zones, part of the culture. And it's so powerful on many levels. But here in America, if you want it, you kind of have to make it. You have to proactively build it. But it's important. If you're lonely in this country, it shaves about 8 years off your life expectancy.
I love how you quantify like every little thing to exactly how many years it either adds or subtracts from your life expectancy.
Well, I work for National Geographic, and the fact checkers occupy the corner offices there. So I've been trained to underpin everything I say with evidence.
Living in America, I find it's really hard. Like I don't right now live with the quote unquote tribe that I grew up with. And in fact, I find that the people I communicate most with are not the healthy, mature people, because they're usually actively engaged in their own lives and families. And, people don't really work that way as groups anymore. Particularly for me, I'm 47 years old. Everybody's kind of busy with, people who I consider good friends. I can call them 4 months from now and we're happy to talk to each other, but it's not like we hang out as a group as often as we could.
Yeah, I wouldn't tell you to dump your old friends, but I would tell you, James, that it might not be a bad idea to maybe you're New York and you're Florida, where you do have a few good friends you can count on that have generally healthy behaviors. We're doing these citywide blue zone projects in Fort Worth, Texas, and Los Angeles, and Iowa, and in every one of our cities, we actually help lots of people build moais. And you'd be shocked at how many lonely people are living in middle America. And when you spend a little time to help them pair up or make these moais, their lives just turn around. And I would have never guessed it, but it's become one of the most powerful facets of our program.
Well, how big is like a moai? Is it 2 people? Is it 5 people?
5. 5 is the ideal because you want intimacy. You want to be able to really, if you're having a tough time with your spouse, you want to be able to talk to these people and have them contribute in a meaningful way and care. And I'd say 5 is ideal. It could go up to 7 and down to 4.
A couple other questions based on a recent talk. You mentioned under the Eat Wisely, and we talked a little bit about plants and the smaller plates. But you mentioned wine at 5. Like, do you think a glass of wine is okay, or better to have no alcohol?
Well, in the Blue Zone solution, the whole idea behind it was to do a meta-analysis of what people were eating in all these blue zones for the last 100 years and really come up with a scientifically rigorous set of guidelines. And indeed, we do see that 4 out of the 5 blue zones people are drinking. They're drinking 2 glasses a day. In one place we saw 3. But it's also interesting how people eat and drink. And I think that's almost more important. If you come home from work and slam 2 glasses of Cabernet, that's not all that good for you. It sends your blood sugar spiking and you'll get an insulin response. It's not good for the pancreas and not good for your chance of diabetes. But if you're drinking that glass of red wine slowly with a Mediterranean meal or Blue Zone meal, you're actually going to triple the flavonoid absorption. In other words, you get 3 times more the nutrients. If you're drinking with friends slowly, your cortisol levels drop, so you're digesting better. The inflammation that comes from stress is mitigated, and so it's not just drinking 2 drinks. It's really how you drink it and the context in which you drink those 2 glasses.
So you mentioned stress, and you've mentioned it a couple of times, but you don't mention. I haven't seen you mention laughter and the importance of laughter in any of this. Is there a role for laughter? And I've seen some studies that suggest that laughter is good for various chronic diseases like cancer, for instance. Norman Cousins has all these studies on this. What's your view on laughter as for helping us live longer?
Well, it was hard to measure happiness, measure laughter. But anecdotally, I can tell you in Okinawa, I spent time with the club who every morning took a dose of what they called vitamin S, which was smile, and they would stand around and laugh. One guy would start laughing, and his laugh was so hilarious it would be infectious with the rest of the group, and then they'd laugh, and they kind of forced themselves to laugh and became happier because of it. And the people who tend to make it to 90 and 100 tend to be likable people with a good sense of humor. They tell jokes. They'll listen and not just yammer. They are empathetic, sympathetic, tend to be generous. The grumps tend to die off. So there's something to laughter and the congenial environment in general.
Well, I like that a lot because also it's related to, and I'm going to start this. Like you mentioned, the Seventh-day Adventists, from Friday sundown to Saturday sundown, they basically have a Sabbath, similar to the Jewish Sabbath, where they just do not do any work and they relax. And that seems to be related to their longevity. So how would you describe, what are kind of the sort of conditions of this Sabbath?
Well, Friday night, it's dinner with the family. Saturday morning, it's their religious gathering. Saturday lunch, they're meeting with their friends. They take their diet directly from the Bible. So they're eating plant-based, Genesis chapter 1, verse 29. And then on Saturday afternoons, right there in their scriptures, prescribes a nature walk. And, we talk about stress and how to relieve stress. But here's a culture where everybody, every week, takes a 1 hour, they call it a sanctuary in time, a 1 day sanctuary in time, where they completely downshift and focus on not where the kids need to be driven or the social schedule or what work is screaming at you to do, but they focus on bigger ideas and take the tension off of themselves and put it on their God. And I actually think it's a really powerful tradition. And Adventists, by the way, live about 10 years longer than the average American.
And
so they're doing something right.
What was interesting there is they're all ethnicities. So it kind of takes out the genes factor.
Genes is only about 20% of how long you live. The other 80% is your lifestyle and your environment. So, yeah, it's a melting pot of people. Americans that live right off the San Bernardino Freeway under the same smog that everybody else lives under, but yet they're living a decade longer. So I think it supremely proves the blue zone's prescriptive.
Yeah. So, one other thing I wanted to ask was a couple months ago, my wife and I decided to throw everything out. So not throw, in some cases we gave away, but basically we decided to instead of organizing our house, we got rid of all of our books, because we have the Kindle. We got rid of all of our clothes except for a few outfits. Got rid of all the extra sheets, pillowcases, furniture, spices we never use, cleaned out everything. And so our house is like almost empty right now. And I found that to be a huge stress reliever. And I'm curious the effect of materialism or lack of materialism on these blue zones.
Yeah, first of all, I think what you did is brilliant. But I can tell you in almost all blue zones, except perhaps the Adventists, they live in very austere houses with few possessions, fewer things to worry about. They don't have huge portfolios or 3 cars to worry about or kids at the private school. A lot of the stuff we aspire to wrongly, they're not worried about it. So they have a lot more time in the day to think about their social connectivity, spending time in their gardens, enjoying life.
Do you think that's related to kind of almost a paleo lifestyle? So let's say Homo sapiens, started off 300,000 years ago. For most of that, there was no sense of possessions because we were moving around a lot. You couldn't carry around. We were nomads. You couldn't carry around your possessions. Do you think, from an evolutionary point of view, it's only a small blip of the lifespan of the tenure of Homo sapiens that we've actually had possessions? So you think that's baked into our DNA somehow?
I think as a rule, what early humans did is a good thing to pay attention to. I mean, for 99.9% of human existence, as you point out, we were semi-nomadic. And by the way, the paleo diet is largely misguided. Most of human history, most of early humans and proto-humans were eating tubers and seeds and plants. It was only after we figured out how to make hand axes that we started breaking into skulls and bones for brains and marrow. And but the general idea, I think, of being free from strictures and stresses is not a bad thing to try to emulate in our lives today.
So Dan, we've talked about a lot of the, I think just listening to this podcast could essentially help someone live to be 100 or more. But tell us, so your book's coming out, The Blue Zone Solution, Eating and Living Like the World's Healthiest People. Tell me some of the things you talk about in the book, without revealing too much that we don't talk about in this podcast. What else are people going to learn from the book? Because I think this is going to be a valuable book to have.
Thank you. So there's three essential parts. One is what were the longest lived people really eating in the food guidelines. You could call it a blue zone diet. Number two, realizing that diets don't last. So how do you set up your life so that eating the right foods becomes mindless? So there's a piece in there about how to set up your kitchen, about how to set up your social life. We actually have a sort of a checklist that allows you to assess your friends to see if they're a net negative or a net positive. Again, I wouldn't tell you to dump your old friends, but I will tell you if they're all eating Doritos and burgers that you might want to augment your social network. But then most of my work these days, I'm a co-director on 23 cities in creating their citywide blue zone public health templates. So how do you set up a city so that the whole place becomes 10 or 20% healthier, which is going to have a much bigger impact over time than trying to get people to change their behavior. So there's 3 chapters in there. And then because my wonderful publisher, National Geographic, encouraged me, I put in the best recipes from all 5 blue zones. So how do you take these foods and make them taste good at home? And
that's genius. Smart of National Geographic.
I fought like hell on that one not to have them, but they convinced me. I hate to say they were right.
Why didn't you want to put it? Just because honestly, it's a lot of work to go around and get all these recipes, but why didn't you want to put it?
James, how many books on your nightstand include recipes?
Well, for me, 0.
Exactly. So my fear was as soon as I wrote a serious book.
But for my wife more than one. I haven't cooked in 20 years. So
I wrote a serious book and I just thought recipes would cheapen it, but Geographic was kind of right in that's what a lot of people want to see. So I put a little bit of everything. It's story-driven science that ends with how you can put it to work in your life.
Well, that's great. So Dan Buettner, and I'm going to spell it so people can search for it correctly on Amazon, Buettner, author of The Blue Zone Solution, Eating and Living Like the World's Healthiest People. April 7th is the publication date. It's coming out Kindle, hardcover, MP3, MP3 CD. Are you going to do an audiobook?
Yes.
Good.
Already out.
People listen to audiobooks. It always surprises me, but it's a big part of sales.
Yeah, now that we have iPods and we're used to reading 140 characters.
Yeah, exactly. So, well, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. I learned a lot. Today's a Friday, and I can tell you I've already talked about it with my wife, Claudia. We are taking tomorrow off, and it's going to be, and hopefully I could do it every Saturday, but we'll see if my kids let me.
And by the way, you can tell Claudia that if you're over 45 and you're having sex at least twice a week, you're twice as likely to live to the next year than if you're not getting it at all. So
that's very good information to know. I will communicate that.
On that note.
Thanks very much, Dan, and I'll talk to you soon.
Oh, James, what a joy.
Excellent. Bye.
For more from James, check out the James Altucher Show on the Stansberry Radio Network at stansberryradio.com and get yourself on the free insiders list today.
AI might be the most important new computer technology ever. It's storming every industry, and literally billions of dollars are being invested. So buckle up. The problem is that AI needs a lot of speed and processing power, so how do you compete without costs spiraling out of control? It's time to upgrade to the next generation of the cloud, Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, or OCI. OCI is a single platform for your infrastructure, database, application development, and AI needs. OCI has 4 to 8 times the bandwidth of other clouds, offers one consistent price instead of variable regional pricing, and of course, nobody does data better than Oracle. So now you can train your AI models at twice the speed and less than half the cost of other clouds. If you want to do more and spend less, like Uber, 8x8, and Databricks Mosaic, take a free test drive of OCI at oracle.com/advance. That's oracle.com/advance. oracle.com/advance.